Welcome to the Skeptic Canary radio show with Tom Williamson.
Good evening, everyone. It is May the 14th, 2014. You are watching / listening to episode 54 of the Skeptic Canary show with myself, Tom Williamson from skepticcanary.com, and my guest this evening is Jonathan M.S. Pearce. Jonathan, good evening.
Good evening. Hello.
How are you today? I hear you've had some quite exciting news.
Yes, yeah, so today's been a good day, and just received a proof copy for a brand new book, so thanks for allowing me to just show this on the screen. It's a anthology of deconversion accounts from around the world, edited with a co-editor, Tristan Vick, and really proud of it, actually. Some really interesting accounts of deconverting from a faith and from organised religion. So lots of psychology and social ramifications, familial ramifications to people deconverting from faith. So interesting stuff.
Excellent, excellent. There's one thing I want to get out of the way, because we're called the Skeptic Canary show because I'm a Canary, I'm a Norwich fan. And I don't know if you follow football, Jonathan, but last weekend Norwich City got relegated from the Premier League. So yes, let's just deal with it now. Yeah, it's done. I'm not happy about it, but anyway.
To be fair, I'm a Portsmouth fan, and you know, your league's literally leagues above us at the moment. So you know, done.
Oh yeah. Okay. Right. What we're going to be talking about this evening is largely philosophy. Jonathan, you are a philosopher.
Yes.
Having written books about free will. I know that you've written about free will, which is a very, very important subject, not just for religious people or ex-religious people, important for secularists and atheists as well.
Well, yeah, if I can just say a thing on free will, I mean, I find it a fascinating subject. I'm doing a talk at Brighton Fringe Festival, actually, at the end of this month, 29th of May, about free will, and it's really, it's a fundamental debate, because almost the religion debate supervenes on the free will debate. So an idea of a judgmental personal God is almost like a non-starter if you don't have free will, unless you're going to be a Calvinist or something like that. So I think it's a fundamental debate, but it's a debate which is popping up loads at the moment. Skeptics are really kind of embracing the idea that free will is illogical and doesn't really make a lot of sense, both philosophically but also empirically from the sciences. So I think it's a fascinating one.
Okay, great. Now, if you're watching and you'd like to get in touch with the show at any point, you can do. You'll find us on Twitter, we're Skeptic Canary, or you can send an email to tom@skepticcanary.com. Okay, fantastic. Now, a major issue within the scientific community at the moment is something that we're going to dwell on quite a lot, which is Neil deGrasse Tyson's apparent dismissal of philosophy. So, John, what do you make of that? I'm guessing you think he's fairly misguided in what he's been saying.
I suppose as a naturalist philosopher, you know, there's a lot of psychology involved in any of these kind of scenarios. So you kind of want to like people like Neil deGrasse Tyson and Lawrence Krauss, who are bringing the skepticism from a scientific point of view. They bring the debate out there to the people, but then when they put their foot in their mouths like that, you just really wish they hadn't, because these are people that in many scenarios you look up to. And I think that's what's happened. You know, Lawrence Krauss has done that famously, and then he was in debate with William Lane Craig, and he kind of dismissed philosophy in the same way, and he got into a lot of trouble for doing that. And it looks like Neil deGrasse Tyson's done pretty much the same thing. And as a philosopher, I think it's not a wise move, really.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. One of the things he seems to think is that we kind of don't need philosophy anymore. That the example he comes up with is Isaac Newton was a scientist and a philosopher, but at some point science and I don't know how he'd express this, but at some point science became separate from philosophy. So how would you address that?
Well, I'd just say that's incorrect. You know, science is a subdivision of philosophy. You know, science used to be called natural philosophy. This philosophy is effectively the study of everything, isn't it? Really. So it involves everything, and everything to me, at least, is a subset in some way of philosophy, science and empiricism. As an epistemology, as a way of looking for and gaining knowledge, or indeed what is knowledge. You know, the scientific method and empiricism is a branch of that. So it's almost like you can't even define what science is without using philosophy, and you can't even if you're so as a scientist, you might have different ways of defining what science is. You might use verificationism, you might use falsifiability, you might use all these kind of terms that help you define what science is. But of course, actually defining those terms and establishing them as a position is doing philosophy. So you can't do science without doing philosophy. And I think just one quote he made, this is a quote from an article in the Weeks that says, he proudly proclaims his irritation with, quote, asking deep questions that lead to a, quote, pointless delay in your progress. So he's talking about having this idea of what is progress for humanity. Okay, and saying that science leads to progress and philosophy doesn't is effectively what he's sort of saying. But of course, establishing what progress is for society is itself a philosophical question. You know, it's almost self-refuting his position. So, you know, he may be right. Philosophy may not give us progress, but you know, how do we establish that, and how do we know when to evaluate whether we're making progress and what that progress is, without doing philosophy to do that?
Yeah, okay. I mean, we've hit a bit of a pet subject of mine, which is the scientific method.
Right.
I do a Skeptic talk on it, and the idea that science doesn't need philosophy anymore for me is absolutely ridiculous, because, as you were saying earlier, the differences between empiricism and inductivism, we were still debating those just last century. I mean, Karl Popper, famous empiricist, who only passed away in the 1990s, is where we get our current view of what the scientific method is and how people should be doing science. So for me to say that we don't need philosophy anymore in terms of science is completely absurd.
Well, even that's interesting because of course that's arguable in itself. So you can sit there and be well within your rights to say a Popperian view of science and the scientific method is what defines science. But I could, you know, I don't necessarily do that, but I could sit here and say, actually, I'm not sure falsifiability or this criterion of what you define science, for me, defines what science is. So even that is open to philosophical question. And that's good and proper. You know, we need to establish what science is, but even then, that might not be a one size fits all for everyone. So, you know, I think we need philosophy. You know, we all do philosophy every day when we try and establish what things should or shouldn't be, and what we think labels should or shouldn't be. So that's philosophy.
And I think it's very interesting that you've written a book about religious deconversion, because I think there's this idea that some people have, is that if you show religious people the evidence, like say a religious person is convinced that the world is 9,000 years old, that the whole universe is thousands of years old. Now you can use science to show that statement is demonstrably false, but just because you do that, does that shake someone's religious belief? And I'd say no.
Well, of course, you've got. I mean, predominant reason people believe is psychology. So what you're playing around with is psychology, but then you've got your rational arguments as well. And so with religion, people usually actually decide whether they're going to believe on a psychological basis and post hoc rationalize. They decide, right, I'm going to believe this, right, now let's go and look for the reasons why. Sometimes you get people that look at the evidence and the reasons why and then decide, which is, a pretty honest approach. But I think generally we're psychological beings, but we use lots of components within that paradigm. So we'll look at your rational arguments and so if you take William Lane Craig, for example, he's generally an empiricist. So he'll look at things and say, well, what's the evidence for this and that? So he usually has his 4 arguments, doesn't he, in debate? And he'll say this or this, and then the Gospels to top it off. But if you see some of his interviews, what he says is, it doesn't really matter what the evidence is because I've got the witness of the Holy Spirit in me. And actually, that... in effect, you can't deconvert. I can't deconvert because that is the core source of my belief, which is fairly unscientific, or it's not empirical, it's not testable, it's not falsifiable, and so therefore the reason why people believe. Empiricism, of course, comes into it, but it's a lot to do with psychology and rational, or in some cases, irrational arguments.
Okay. Let's talk about free will then, because I mentioned earlier that free will often seen as a concern for the religious. So it's usually framed, well, in my experience anyway, it's usually framed with this idea that if there is an all-powerful, all-knowing God, and he knows everything that you have done and everything that you will ever do, then you can't have free will because it's already been predetermined, and if it wasn't, then God wouldn't know what it was. But that is also a question for people who don't believe in God, isn't it?
Well, I mean, so the classic area of free will, the first step in the debate is what is free will, like the definition of it. And I would define it as the ability to do otherwise, which means that if we make a decision and then we carry on playing the world out for 10 minutes and then rewound that 10 minutes, would or could I make a different decision? And I deny that ability to do, at least for me to be able to consciously do that. You can imagine quantum fluctuations and this and that might make you choose differently, but you're not authoring that in the sense of owning that decision. And so that's how I define free will, but a lot of people don't define it as such, and therefore they define being able to have free will and this idea of determinism. Oops, sorry, that's my phone. So being able to sorry about that. So being able to have determinism and free will at the same time is obviously means that you have to redefine the idea of what a free choice is, whether it's the ability to choose otherwise or not. I go for that basic idea of what free will is, and rewinding the world. So can you have a different decision in exactly the same situation? Because that's what most people understand it out on the streets. If you were to go and say, what is free will? It's like, well, I could choose this, but in that same situation, I could also choose that. So given that understanding of free will, and given this idea that God knows everything in advance, predetermined the world, or knows the world in advance, can you have free will? So can you, if it's indubitably known that you're going to do something at 9:15 on Tuesday morning, right? Can that be a free choice, a free decision? And I would deny that it can be. And religious people come up with contrived and ad hoc sort of ways of trying to get around that, which don't, in my opinion, work. So I think that's the core area. And I think this omniscient God idea is really problematic and kind of falsifies free will. So that's why you see at the moment some theologians and Christian thinkers embrace a type of theism called open theism or process theism, where they say, well, actually, God doesn't know freely willed decisions, and actually we can find some evidence for that in the Bible, and it makes better sense, and that's why there's so much suffering in the world. So it's a way of getting around the problem of evil. Why is there so much suffering? Is it gratuitous? And if God doesn't know freely willed decisions because it's impossible to know that, it's logically impossible for God to know that, then perhaps that kind of the theology is coherent. So there are ways of trying to get around it, but I think generally you can't do it and remain, coherent.
Okay. So do you get a cognitive dissonance between what people are experiencing and what their religion tells them? Is that a major part of deconversion, trying to overcome that?
Well, I think cognitive dissonance is a major part of pretty much every human's life. Whether you and I will go through cognitive dissonance on most days. You're talking about football, so you would have watched Norwich at the weekend, and so would have a Manchester United fan, and it was Norwich against Man U, wasn't it?
Arsenal.
Oh, it's Arsenal. Sorry, it's Man U. Yeah, against Arsenal. So there might have been a foul for a free kick. And you would have seen the same data as the Arsenal fan, and you would be shouting at the ref saying that's totally unfair, and they would be saying, well, that's totally brilliant, of course that was a foul, and whatnot, and your brain is taking in the evidence and trying to cohere that with your core belief, which is my team are brilliant and they can't do any wrong. And then what happens is you get this psychological meshing of the two, or a flat rejection of one. And as I say, we do that all the time. All humans do that, and religious people do it very much so. So take prayer, for example. The idea that God answers prayers and intercedes in the world, and B, the evidence that God doesn't do that. so how does the evidence fit with the belief? Well, actually, what happens is, so they'll do double-blind tests in hospitals and find out that actually intercessory prayer, at least when we test it, doesn't work. So they'll say, well, you can't test God. God moves in mysterious ways, and they'll have mechanisms which allow the data to fit with the core belief, or a way to reject the data outright. And that happens, so prayer is just one example, but in religion that happens an awful lot. You've got suffering, you've got this, that, and rather than ditch God, they'll come up with theology. It's possibly just cognitive dissonance, isn't it? It's like I've got this belief in, I like that, I might use that. But you've got right, your core belief in God, and then you've got all this evidence that doesn't fit. So how do I come up with ad hoc and crazy reasons and philosophy that will make that evidence fit, and that's theology. Yeah, I think that works.
Okay, that's fair enough. It's interesting that you mentioned football, because there's one conundrum that one personal conundrum that I've never quite been able to satisfactorily answer for myself, which is, why do I care about football? Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it's
Sorry, I was going to say that's psychology, but yeah, carry on.
Yeah, it's just this idea that you've got 11 men versus 11 kicking a football around every Saturday, and I just think, well, I'm a man of reason, I'm a man of science, so why do I care so much about this sporting event?
And I think that's interesting. So you have your kind of rational, skeptical side that to some extent, and I've thought about this quite a lot over the years, that when you become very, very rational and very logical, which I like to think I am, and I have become more so, and I don't like to say that as if I'm logical and rational and religious people aren't, for example, because I think that's a dangerous thing to say, but I have seen myself become overtly more rational and black and white in the way I think, and very logical, and actually that takes to a degree an amount of emotion out of my life. So we talk about the emotional side of humanity, and perhaps a kind of irrational side to emotionality, to emotion, and I think sometimes it's good to stay in touch with some kind of irrational things like getting really into a football team and supporting them, you know, against your better sort of rational judgment. But at the end of the day, as I said, it is psychology, in-group, out-group psychology, you know, tribalism, where I identify with this area and I'm going to keep in my in-group, and the way that I show this is by supporting this team, and we're going to play another team and they're the out-group, and evolution has built into us a psychology which really promotes that kind of situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, another way I used to look at it was that football is kind of an escape from the logical, rational world. I mean, it makes no sense to get angry and like really shout at players for you know, kicking the ball in the wrong direction or whatever. So it was really good for me as a kid, because, you know, I studied hard at school and whatever, and a football match was just something where I could do something completely different, you know?
Yeah, well, it's interesting you say that, because as a determinist, I see the world as people do what people do, and that they follow that one path. And yes, they might be kind of authors of their decisions by the point of fact that they're a vessel and they author things, but they can't necessarily have done it otherwise. So therefore, and in my better days, I am much more level-headed, and it's all about blame and praise, isn't it? So is it right to praise someone that would have done that anyway, that was, you know, for example, someone that's an Olympic swimmer, Ian Thorpe, who's born with massive feet, who is born with the genetics that give him really good physique, that has very caring parents that can take him down the swimming pool day in, day out, blah, blah, blah. He wins a bunch of Olympic medals. Do I go, yeah, well done? You know, if I was Australian, yeah, well done, that's an amazing, he's such an amazing swimmer, well done, that's so cool. Or do I go, well, do you know what? He was in a position to have done that, and I'm not sure that it warrants praise. But then the human side of me, of course, like anyone, follows a sport and just gets really into it. So, you know, when I'm being more rational, you can see why some of these things are actually philosophically a little bit incoherent. And then on other days, I will shout at my children as if they had free will. You know, I can't get away from the idea that the illusion of free will. And in fact, I think it was Strawson, one of the Strawsons, P. Strawson, back in the 60s, saying in denying free will, in fact, we are so psychologically married to free will that we can't ditch it, even though it doesn't exist. We just can't ditch it. And Saul Smolanski, an Israeli philosopher, said that the illusion of free will is just totally necessary to society. So even though us philosophers know it doesn't exist, don't tell anyone else.
Okay.
Oh. So I think in fitting with football, yeah, you know, following football might be a bit irrational, and certainly following Norwich is certainly irrational. Oh, yes. But against your better judgment, but that's what it is, possibly to be human. You know, discuss.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, obviously it's not just football. There's so many things. We were having a discussion on. About this the other week, actually, to do with something that I think you've written about before, the vegetarianism,
right? Okay.
And veganism. And a friend of mine was trying to, a friend of mine who's a meat eater was trying to rationalise why do I eat meat? And there's one argument that people keep ignoring, but as far as I can see, it is an argument that at least needs to be considered, and that is the hedonistic argument, that we eat meat because we like it. And I know that isn't the nicest argument, but we do a lot of things because we like it. So, you know, I just think we really need to consider that when people are trying to make the choice into whether to be a meat eater, a vegetarian, or a vegan, or a pescatarian.
Yeah.
The whole range. You know?
Well, I find it fascinating. You know, in fact, I do a counter-apologetic segment on a podcast, on a Skeptical podcast, and two segments I did were about vegetarianism, so not particularly about sort of religion and whatnot. And I was addressing some of the panels comments from a previous podcast how they eat meat and they don't really see it as a morally bad, particularly to eat meat. And I took that to task, and my main point was, being a vegetarian is morally better than being a meat eater, right? For a lot of reasons, and I haven't got time to go into that now. But if we take it as fact, not saying it definitely is, but if we take it as fact that being a vegetarian is morally better than being a meat eater, the idea is that we are just morally imperfect, and I think we should just accept that, do you know what, we're morally imperfect, but I like eating meat. Because when you're talking about consequentialist ethics, so I derive my moral value in an action by the consequences it obtains, then there's no end to how perfect you should be. Right? Do I go out and sweep the road in front of me like a Jain in India so I don't walk on ants? You know, that would be morally better, yeah, but pragmatically, realistically, do I want to do that? No. So at some point we draw a kind of arbitrary line of like how good we're going to be, okay? Because you can always be, on consequentialism, utilitarianism, you can always be a little bit better. Right, and there are lots of intricate ways of looking at consequentialism, but the idea is that I think that really what happens is people know that they would be morally better to be vegetarian, but they can't be bothered to be vegetarian, so they post hoc rationalize all these reasons why eating meat's fine. But just accept that you're morally imperfect, but you just like eating meat more than you can be bothered to be morally perfect.
Well, yeah, but it's all on a scale, isn't it? I mean, yeah. If no one did anything because they liked it, then there's a huge amount of things that people just wouldn't do, no?
Well, that's really interesting. So I presume every action on Earth has a moral dimension. Literally, like if I get up and walk to the other side of the room, right, you could argue that I'm using energy that I could better put towards maybe looking online to see how much money I can donate to Oxfam, right? So therefore, by walking across the room, I'm not doing something else which I could do which would better the world. And so therefore, in a sense, every action or every inaction has a moral dimension. And so therefore, you're absolutely right. But you know, we aren't morally perfect, and where do we draw that line over what we should and shouldn't do? And so therefore, it's accepting that situation, but it's also maybe drawing rules of thumb out. So you know, like I'm going to be do this, but generally I'm not going to do that all my life. I'm not going to go to a hospital and donate all my organs to the hospital because I don't want to, and it would be morally better if I did because I could save 10 people's lives, but I just don't want to do that. And you know, you kind of muddle your way through life. You intuitively live by this kind of consequentialist ethics. Most people do, but actually you don't take it to the nth degree, which is why things like virtue ethics are quite interesting, because it's like, how do I live a virtuous life? And maybe that's a good judge of how I should be morally.
Okay. Right, well, we're about halfway through the show, so just want to remind people of how they can get in touch. They can do so via Twitter. I'm at Skeptic Canary, or you can email tom@skepticcanary.com. If you'd like to join us on the show, I just tweeted out the link to this Google Hangout, so if you'd like to join us and talk about philosophy, ethics, Neil deGrasse Tyson's views on philosophy, you can do so by following the link. Okay. What should we discuss next?
Well, I was going to just to return to Neil deGrasse Tyson. So he is being accused in some quarters of this kind of scientism, and you hear the term scientism come up more and more. Normally, it's a term associated with religious people who accuse skeptics of being over-reliant on science and being into scientism. But it's interesting. So people like Massimo Pigliucci, who is is a philosopher of science, started off in science and become a philosopher of science, used to host Rationally Speaking, now does Ciencia Salon. He's had a go at Neil deGrasse Tyson as being, into scientism and whatnot, and I think there is a point there, and I think that it goes back to what we were originally saying about philosophy is useful to humanity, and scientists need philosophy and use philosophy, and you shouldn't be over reliant on empiricism, because that in itself is almost a philosophical position. And so I just sort of bring in, basically Massimo Pigliucci as a force to defend my position.
Certainly, certainly. Well, we have been joined on the call. We've been joined by Dan Thinker. Dan, good evening.
Hi, Tom. Thanks for having me on.
Yes, no problem.
Hello.
No problem.
Hi, Jonathan. Nice to meet you.
Yeah. Well, we've been talking about ethics, which I know is Dan teaches a class on ethics, as you can see from his lower third. But we've been talking about things that Neil deGrasse Tyson has been saying about philosophy and the worth of philosophy, in particular in relation to science. So, Dan, what are your views on that?
Well, my first thought was when he said that he doesn't like to get lost in all these meaningless discussions of the meanings of words. I completely actually agreed with that. That's why I still call Pluto a planet, personally. But no, seriously.
I like that.
That's a good point.
That's really what this comes down to, right? Is that semantics is a part of everybody's work in the sciences, and so to trivialize that, the struggle to clarify our concepts and our words, as though that can never have any value, is a serious problem. And that's why it's important whether or not Pluto is a planet. That it's because words mean things, and how we use them, how we order our concepts matters. And there's a few things I would say, just a few quick points. And I'm sorry I missed the first 10 minutes when you were actually talking about this. But I would say, first of all, that it's almost I would say, let me say this. I think the most charitable thing to say about Tyson's remarks, the most charitable way to read them, I think would be like this. I think that there's a certain way in which physicists need to think about problems in order to figure out what is a fruitful, productive line of research in physics or not. And I think that they have to be able to think in terms of what is capable of being modeled and what is empirically testable, and all of these sorts of things. And I think that they have to have, as a physicist, they have to be working on the kinds of definitions and the kinds of accounts of things that can have a tangible physics meaning. And I think that his concern may have been that learning that sort of boundary is not something that physics students, when he was talking about physics students, would necessarily learn from philosophers. I'm reminded of Sean Carroll talking to William Lane Craig and stressing to him that it's not like cosmologists go to a cosmology conference and debate whether or not maybe all this cosmology is leading to the existence of God as some invaluable explanatory principle like Craig is insisting you get from that. He's like, we can do the modeling within purely cosmological terms, and this metaphysical add-on is completely superfluous to that. And it's good that physicists can think that way, and I think that insofar as that's what was being said, I can understand that. However, I think that the problem is, number one, that you can't really rein in a priori what is going to ever be a transfer from a philosophical issue to a theoretical physics. So, I mean, the atom used to be a metaphysical postulate. Now it's physics. There's a lot of this where there's theoretics in physics that are serious and mathematical and conceptual, and there is some bleed over there where some well-informed philosophers of science could be helpful and have been helpful. The issue, though, is that of course, the average philosopher may not be well enough educated in physics to do this. So there's some embarrassing things philosophers will say because it's not our specialization. There can be crossover embarrassments. But again, we have that right here with the scientists who don't understand philosophy. That's also another consideration there.
I think. Can I say something, Dan? I really am excited at the moment at the prospect of Sean Carroll just erupting onto the debate scene and the public scene, and he's such a good sort of erudite, personable speaker that bridges a gap between science and philosophy and the public so well. And I think it's so refreshing to have someone that's got a deep understanding of science, but also has a pretty deep understanding of philosophy. And I think if you see what the work he did on the Moving Naturalism Forward videos, which are available on YouTube through Sean Carroll's through his channel, the mix of the range of scientists and philosophers of science on that panel, I just think it's brilliant. And I think that we need more people who have the expertise across disciplines, because if you've got to understand that William Lane Craig has that to some degree, going the other way, going probably from philosophy through science to a degree, and naturalists, if we're going to fight the likes of William Lane Craig, need that cross-discipline skill.
Exactly, but yet the issue is that the average philosopher touches on everything. We touch on art if we're into aesthetics. We touch on psychology if we're into morality. Like none of us can be everything in all these fields, and that's going to be a limit on any given philosopher. But I would also say that what's key is that there have also been places in which in the cognitive sciences where there's a lot of bleed over and overlap right now going on. There's a tremendous amount of importance with psychological findings, because if you don't have philosophical clarity on what the difference between reason and emotion is, or what a norm is, then psychological observations about how people formulate their norms or formulate their moral judgments, when you're trying to determine, well, what's a rational way to do that or an irrational way, and like what would constitute norm following or not, those are questions that are philosophical in nature. And so even though you need this empirical science, and I'm fully on board with everything that's going on in terms of trying to figure out how people process things morally, you have to have good conceptual clarification about what the data means. What's the implication of an experiment that finds that people have an emotional response when they make a moral judgment? What does that mean to normative terms? What does that mean to right and wrong and true and false? Those are epistemological questions, and if we take the attitude that the only valuable method is the empirical method and not also conceptual clarifying philosophical methods, then, and logic and coherence and consistency and all the theoretical virtues philosophers train in, then what we have is ill-formed concepts by our psychologists, ill-formed concepts everywhere where they can't pin it to something extremely empirical.
I think that, if I can come in, I think that's a really interesting discipline as well, because moral philosophy classically has these three subdivisions. So your descriptive area, which is actually what is going on in the world. What do people, how do we moralize, and so on and so forth. And that's your empirical evidence, really. That's your science. And then you look at your prescriptive ethics, so what should we do? Let's argue about what moral value system we should use. And then you've got your meta-ethics, which is even more philosophical, which is like, well, what does right and wrong mean? What does ought mean? What is a moral obligation? How can we define what these terms mean? And so you've got this lovely progression, one way or the other, which really you shouldn't do one to the exclusion of the others, and the whole package is your kind of natural science, natural philosophy. It's all in one nice package.
I think there's one ethical question that every working scientist should consider, and certainly people who've worked at CERN, is that science costs money. So if you have say everything that's been happening at CERN with the Large Hadron Collider and all the experiments that provided evidence for the existence of the Higgs boson, all of that cost billions and billions and billions. And I think that if you're a scientist and you haven't at least considered the ethics of what you're doing, just in a very, very simple terms, like all that money could have been spent on feeding the poor, just for example.
Yeah,
So,
but come on, Tom. I mean, you could spend billions of quid feeding the poor, but you could spend billions of quid disproving God. So, you know, what are you going to do?
Yeah. What I'm saying is obviously I think that money being spent at CERN is completely justified. But what I'm saying is that scientists should know the moral arguments and should know the justifications for where that money's going.
Of course, you're absolutely right. Yeah.
But I think, and you know, the Tyson said that it's fine that there's room for philosophers doing political philosophy and ethical philosophy and religious philosophy. But I think that the key though here is has science gotten rid of the need for robust philosophy in these areas? And the other thing I would say to that question from what Tyson raised is that it's a definitional trap. Is that by definition, philosophy will be that which is not strictly right now, empirically something you put in a scientific journal. That's why it's going to be called philosophy. Once it crosses the threshold into going into the journal, now it counts as psychology or physics. So if you're going to define it that way, you're going to define it into irrelevance. But that doesn't mean that the kinds of insights where we work on don't matter. And it also, you have to remember that it's, and Pilucci made this analogy, and I think it's important, that there's a certain conceptual space that we're mapping. We're working out the relationships between concepts, and that is a formal kind of thing to a certain extent, where we have to be consistent with what the science is showing us, but it's a matter of finding formal relationships and understanding them. It's more akin to math on that level than it is to empirical science. The relevance of it will be, as with math, that will come up when the science has a use for it. Yeah.
Oh, that's an interesting idea to bring in maths, because of course maths is a funny thing, because at root it's deeply philosophical. You know, it's the most, you know, is it Platonic? Do we have formalism? You know, what is the ontology of mathematical number, quantity, equations and whatnot? So and yet people say, well, maths underwrites physics and physics underwrites, you know, all of science, and so therefore in a funny way you can argue, you could go to Neil deGrasse Tyson and say, well, you know, your fundamental particles, are they purely philosophical, you know, abstracts in a sense?
Right. So,
you know,
yeah, there I would defend Tyson, and I think that leads to a good point, and it's great you bring that up. And I think what Tyson would say to that is that there's a certain way in which the physics explanations are basic, and that they don't depend on philosophy to come and underwrite them. And I do think that there's something to that. I think that that's what he's partially worried about. You know, is that idea that somehow, like let's say for example, the philosophers all mysteriously came to the conclusion that, you know, that science was merely a construct. Then there would still not be any reason to not say there are protons and neutrons and electrons. The reasons to say that are within physics. They don't depend upon philosophers signing off on them. But I do think that where there's a question that I think he may have been secretly referring to and thinking about is this problem of nothing. That might be hidden in the background here. Because we recently had this debate with Lawrence Krauss, right?
Right.
Where Lawrence Krauss came out and said the only definition of nothing is the physics one, because that's the only one that we can work with and model and make any sense of in empirical progress terms. And if you spend your time worried about whether or not there could be nothing and getting into the linguistic trap of that and the conceptual trap of that, that would seem to be a mistake when, according to these physicists, if you can just work within the physics, their definition of nothing works within what they're talking about. And again, I think that Tyson's overreaching there, in that, you know, I think Krauss is overreaching there, and Tyson's with him, in that what they're not they're not allowing that yes, within the realm of physical descriptions, these are their basic terms and it's right for them to think in them, but that doesn't remove all other conceptual issues and all other logical follow-outs from things we believe.
Which is why they necessarily sort of reject philosophy then in that sense, is because they don't then have to deal with those other ideas of which they, as you said before, they're not well versed in, and that would confuse their own sort of paradigm. That's
it. Their tools can't do it. That's the issue. They're not training themselves to think like this. And that's to the betterment of their doing physics. So they'd have to unlearn the way that they formulate their problems to think this way. And I think that's what they're rejecting.
Yeah, yeah. And it's interesting, before you came on, I was saying to Tom that he had a quote, and I'll say it again, this is from an article that quotes deGrasse Tyson. So he proudly proclaims his irritation with, quote, asking deep questions, end quote, that lead to a, quote, pointless delay in your progress. And it's this idea that he's stating, and you mentioned earlier, empirical progress. You use that term as if that's what Krauss and Tyson mean by progress. And I don't know if that is, or whether they're thinking a kind of progress of humanity, and whether it's necessary for progress of humanity to have this very much empirical state of affairs. But that in itself is a highly philosophically charged debate. You know, what is progress? Are we making it? And what's that got to do with empiricism per se?
Right, and in fact, what made Cosmos so amazing was Sagan, the original. I mean, but like the thing is, here's the irony, is that I meet so many hard-headed science people. I don't mean that in a negative sense. I mean hard-nosed, I should say. I'm sorry, hard-nosed science people. I only want the facts, and extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and they cite Sagan as their hero. And then I finally turn on Cosmos, and what do I see? The first 10 minutes is basically a religious, philosophical justification of the whole endeavor, what they're about to do. It is an account of our place in the cosmos. It is emotionally stirring, and it is trying to draw on science and connect it to values. It's trying to connect it to a principled epistemology, which is philosophy, towards an ethics of saving the planet, towards a life projection and goal of leaving the planet, going to the stars. It is an emotional and philosophical. I don't mean to say philosophy is emotional, but it's both of them. It captures a religious and philosophical picture of the world, and this is the guy that all these hard-nosed scientists keep telling me to go watch, and this is the guy Neil deGrasse Tyson's trying to fill his shoes. Yeah. And yet here he is saying, oh, those kinds of questions, we're losing brain power. We're losing brain power because we have philosophers working on ethics instead of physics? Look, if you want to talk about progressing humanity, you don't talk about just having empirical science without good ethics, without good politics, without good epistemology among the public. With if you don't want to, and he also does this on the atheism issue, where he just tries to evade that, and I get it because he's a public teacher of science, public educator, doesn't want to lose people. But this concern, this idea that these values debates should be just shoved aside so real progress can happen, when the difference between us killing ourselves through nuclear war or killing ourselves through destroying the environment, killing ourselves in all these things, it's not scientific progress in the way all the time. The problem is actually, an inability to get our values to catch up to our scientific progress.
I love the way, Dan, that you've just actually literally married emotion and philosophy there. It was just beautiful.
I'm sorry to kind of pontificate.
No, that's a wonderful thing, Yeah. Damn it, philosophy makes me angry, at times frustrated, and bloody happy as well. I mean, it is the most emotionally charged thing. I love it. But I think essentially what we're saying, perhaps, is that really science supervenes on philosophy, in a really basic manner, and you know, as I said again before you came on, Dan, if science is about defining terms, both within science, but also what is science, that's a semantic and a philosophical, certainly philosophy of science pastime. You know, you know, again, is it falsifiability? Is it verification? Is it what is science? And then for a scientist to then kind of dismiss philosophy so easily, I think that's quite dangerous.
And to use that terrible phrase, like, oh, going on asking questions all day, like you know, like you can't cross the street because you're asking questions. I'm like, this is the guy who's on TV trying to inspire people to care about learning, and he's making fun of asking questions.
Which is one of the first steps. It's one of the first steps of the scientific method. So yeah.
And just the rhetoric of it is so awful, even if he didn't mean it that way. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Tom. What do you want to say? I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. It's fine. Well, I also wonder how you could be a scientist without considering ethics. And scientists consider ethics all the time. I mean, if you ever work on disease modeling and you have to infect and dissect a mouse, you have to do the paperwork and take in various ethical considerations. The people who made the atom bomb, you could say, well, that's just simple science. That's we worked towards splitting an atom and we did it. But of course, the people behind it, huge ethical considerations there because of what the atom bomb did. So
well, you've got whole disciplines of bioethics and you know, ethics within science in other areas of science, and it is you know, there is this, well, which way does it go? You know, do I ask a moral question and see if science can answer it, or does science lead me to ask a moral question, and then you get sort of people like Sam Harris coming in and saying, well, science can answer the moral questions, which I think. Which actually, I know Dan gives the right chuckle there maybe, but I think the way Richard Carrier, I've seen him approach the subject with a little bit more sophistication, I think there is an interesting discussion to be had there on the is-or sort of debate.
Let me say two things about that. I mean, on the one hand, I think that the scientists might feel like, well, look, you learn about these ethics of scientific practice when you're actually the scientist who knows all the details. The armchair philosopher is not going to be adequate to tell us about medical ethics if they don't know what it is to be, you know, in medical terms, what's going on, or, you know, in real terms, the situation. And so there could be an argument that actually that kind of thing is out of the practice itself. You figure out these ethical needs. The other issue there.
Can I just come in on that, because that's interesting. Because consequentialism itself requires knowledge, doesn't it, of the consequences, or knowledge of the whole equation. So if that is going to be your moral value system, which generally is probably going to be something like that, certainly for scientists and what have you. Actually, that's probably unfair to say that, but knowledge is key to making that moral judgment. So sorry. Yeah,
and that's part of it. And there's an analogy in epistemology where, and I do think philosophers of science are right about this to an extent, that scientists are doing what works to lead to knowledge, and they're not waiting for philosophers to tell them how to do it. Scientists develop the tools and techniques and the strategies within the practice of science. In other words, there are empirical methods for testing the empirical methods they use and refining those methods. So now, what's valuable, though, about philosophy in both of these areas, though, is that by also having a separate discipline of focusing on ethics in its own right, on epistemology in its own right, we can do things like have general insights that can then inform the scientist whose primary action is engaged in their actual practice. So we can have a formalism that can kind of help them in that auxiliary way, acknowledging that they develop these things also from within. But the one other thing I want to say about this idea of empiricism and morality, I do think morality needs to be empirical. I just don't think that means it's science rather than philosophy. And so, in other words, I think that, I mean, me, I'm a kind of a consequentialist. I don't believe that the good is maximizing pleasure states. I believe it's maximizing functional power of the most number, the greatest number. So, like, I'm more interested in people being thriving in their abilities and in their capacities than I am in them just being pleased, right?
Is
So
that
that's
like
my different sense.
is that like a consequentialist of virtue ethics?
Yeah, it's a consequentialist virtue ethics, exactly. It's a perfectionism is the broad umbrella. So I'm an Aristotelian, I'm a Nietzschean, and a consequentialist. And so my goal, my interest is maximally powerful humanity, you know, thriving into our maximum abilities. And so when you look at that, then, well, that's going to be empirical. We're going to have to ask very context-sensitive questions about, you know, what is our nature really like? How do we, you know, how do we actually thrive? How do our emotions are set up? But I also think that we also have to be, where I don't like it going into the realm of science, is that the scientists tend to be like, well, this is how our moral systems are set up. This is the way what the brain does. Therefore, morality is this emotional response, and that's it. Or this set of judgments, that's it. So then what? Well, what about that? What I want to ask is,
That's the
once
genetic
we figure those out,
or naturalistic fallacy.
yeah, right. So exactly, that's the naturalistic fallacy to just say this is the way our cognitive system does process morality. I want to ask, how can we exploit the actual mechanisms in order to develop codes and practices which lead to the maximum flourishing? So I don't want to just stop with, oh, well, we looked at how the brain works, that's what morality is. No, that's the mistake of scientism with respect to morality.
Mm-hmm. And there's one point that I'd like to make, that if you've decided on a morality, then say if you've decided with lab animals that you want to, if you are going to use them and you have to kill them, then you want to kill them with the least amount of pain possible. Science might be able to tell you that that the method of dispatching that you've chosen, they will tell you how much pain the animals are feeling, but the decision to minimize pain in the first place, that comes from philosophy, no?
It does, but it also comes from an empathetic scientist having an experience of causing unnecessary pain and going, maybe we should reanalyze what we're doing here, right? So it is also that. And that's why, like, you know, in other words, what is it? It's normative thinking, it's ethical thinking. It might happen in the scientist who has hands-on acknowledgement of what the situation is.
So here's an interesting point. So if a human had no empathy at all, because we know that empathy is pragmatically and descriptively a hugely integral part of morality, or at least the way that we do it on a day-to-day basis. But you know, rationally, could you have a human that just had no empathy, and then you know, just had to you know, commit moral evaluations just based purely on rationality? You know, I wonder if that's even possible. But
well, I mean, it would be in the sense that if I'm right, if I'm right and their good is in maximally being empowered, then and then you know, have to just do a couple quick steps. Morality would then be justified by two things. One would be that moral systems are the systems of cooperation, which are the precondition of our own flourishing well. So someone who didn't have the emotional feelings but still could do the calculations about the good of upholding this rule, because in the long run they're going to depend upon it, and they don't want to participate in a system which is self-contradictory, because that would undermine their own flourishing, then they would have a rational reason, I would hope. The other thing would be that someone without empathy, if they saw that power, and what I want to argue is that genuine power is functioning well, is what you are, and if they saw that their functioning in their powers was greater the more that other people functioned, and they, because of them, and they could say, I am powerful through them, therefore their power is my power. If they could have that sort of rational recognition, even without empathy, even selfishly, they could have a motive. That's my argument.
Which is actually how certain autistics work, who lack that empathy, and they have to cognitively learn certain behaviours, because obviously it's of benefit to them in being socially, you know, complex beings. So yeah.
Yep.
Guys, it's been an absolutely fascinating discussion, but I'm afraid we've run out of time.
Boo.
Yeah, so guys, what I always do just before we finish is give my guests a chance to plug whatever they want to plug. So Jonathan, I know that you have a blog, you have books out, so
Yeah,
feel
so my
free.
blog is www.skepticinc.com/tippling. The blog is called A Tippling Philosopher, and the latest book I've got out is called Beyond and Absent Faith. So it's a book about deconversion accounts from all corners of the world. Please check it out. It's on ebook, and this is a proof copy, so it should be out on paperback in about a week or two. So thanks, and thanks very much for the pleasure of being on here with you guys.
No problem, no problem. Dan, you may. You have the same privilege.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for. I'm sorry, it's a bull in a china shop, but I just had so much to get out. And anyway, my blog is a bull in a china shop. I'm just kidding. My blog is called Camels with Hammers, and if you write me at camelswithhammers@gmail.com, you can find out how to take online philosophy classes right here in a hangout with me. That'd be awesome.
Can I just say, Dan, I've dropped by Camels with Hammers on occasion, and a really enjoyable blog, but also I've seen you do online courses, and your name pops up all the time, and so it's interesting to put a face to a name. So,
yeah, thank you. Yes, pleasure meeting you.
Fantastic, guys. Right, that is the end of tonight's show. We will see you next week. Okay, bye.